And so today, Mark gives us yet another healing story. And as I alluded to last week, we should get used to this because in Mark's gospel, Jesus has two primary actions. He teaches and he heals people. Now, if we're going to continue to unpack this gospel for the rest of this calendar year almost, and we keep hearing just more stories of healing after healing, I think it's important that we begin to understand what's happening here in Mark's gospel. Because if the only thing that we can focus on are the actual actions of the healing, we miss the actual depth and the truth of what Mark's gospel has to offer us. And while we love the healing stories because they make us feel warm and they give us some hope about our own healing in all the ways that we need it, the healings can also become like a shiny object that distract us from the full story that Mark is trying to tell. And so I think it's important for us to get into the context just a little bit, to talk about what Mark is up to and what Mark's Jesus is about, so that as we continue to unpack this and hear more stories, we can understand them at a more deep level. And one of the very first things that Mark wants us to recognize, if we listen closely to the language he uses, is the urgency with which Jesus moves in his gospel. We will hear the word immediately a lot, or as soon as, giving us this idea that Jesus quickly moves from one event and one teaching and one healing session to another. And as a matter of fact, in the first 28 verses of this gospel, the first chapter, Jesus is ushered in by John the Baptist. He gets baptized. He goes into the wilderness, gets tempted by the devil. He comes out of the wilderness, calls for disciples, goes to the synagogue, teaches, and heals a demon, a demoniac, in just 28 verses. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is the sense of urgency that Mark wants to convey to us? What is the rush here? And I think in order to understand that, we have to understand some more of the context. Because the other thing that's very important to Mark in all of the gospel is the simple thing of geography. Where Jesus teaches and where he heals are of great significance for us to understand Jesus as Mark gives him to us. Jesus begins on the margins. He's literally one of the crowd and steps out of the crowd and into the Jordan to be baptized. And then he moves into the wilderness, again, on the fringes of society. And when he does come into the city, he comes into Capernaum, and he walks into the synagogue, which is the center of everything in the Jewish community, the social, economic, and religious hub. And when he teaches and heals there, he is not accepted. And so what Mark tells us today is that Jesus' mission becomes very clear to him. And he says, I will go preach my mission to the neighboring villages. Now, this is important because the word that Mark uses here, the term he uses, is unique. And when he says villages, he's not talking about the next neighboring town. He's not just talking about going down the road and stopping wherever the population is at the time. He's talking about going out into the middle of nowhere to find people, where clans have banded together in order to survive. So literally, Jesus' mission in Mark is to go out into the middle of nowhere to find these people who have been so cut off from the rest of society that they are unable to survive without each other. These are the sick. These are the impure, the ones who aren't allowed to be in regular society. These are the unemployable, the disenfranchised, the people with no rights, with no dignity. And this becomes Jesus' mission, to heal those people. My friends, we have to ask ourselves this question. If this is all there is to Jesus' ministry, if it's simply about healing people, if it's simply about a ministry of compassion, why would the temple scribes become so angry? Why would Jesus be executed for that simple ministry of love? And what Mark wants us to understand clearly, and what Jesus wants us to understand clearly, is that there's more going on here than physical and mental and spiritual healing. What Jesus is doing is ushering in the current moment, in that present moment, the reign of God. And what Jesus is trying to tell us, is trying to teach us, is that this is what the reign of God looks like. It is when we break down the barriers between people, when we restore wholeness to people so there is no difference between me and you. There's no difference between us and them. That everyone has full dignity and everyone is able to participate in our religious institutions, in our public and social institutions, that everyone has a shot at not only surviving, but thriving. This, my friends, is what the reign of God looks like in the Gospel of Mark. And this, my friends, is a threat to the civic order. Because if you are a scribe in the synagogue and you have that kind of power to decide who's in and who's out, who gets to come to worship and who cannot, and if you have so much power that you can deem another person unclean to where no one will come near them or touch them, then this gospel of inclusion and uplifting is a threat. And that, my friends, will get you killed every time. So this is the Jesus that Mark gives to us that we are going to have to wrestle with together to decide what that really means. And so while we embrace those healing stories for our own hope that there is restoration and wholeness for all of us, let us be very clear that it really is for all of us. And that we do not get to ever decide if we really believe in the reign of God that someone else is not worthy of that. Have you not seen? Have you not known? Have you not heard? Now we know. Now we know what Mark is getting at. Now we know what the reign of God looks like for Jesus. Now the question is, are we going to let that information that we have about what Mark is trying to share with us move into our hearts? Because if we let it move into our hearts, it begins to shift our vision. It begins to change the way we see other people. We begin to recognize that we are them and they are us. We begin to recognize that the reign of God demands that we broaden the welcome and that we lift each other up. And if our heart is moved by that reality and by that gospel and by that vision of the reign of God, then we also have to ask ourselves, and what are we going to do about it? Will we let it move from our head to our heart into our hands? Will we reach out to other people and draw them into the warmth of God's love? Will we reach out to the people and help lift them up out of their circumstances? Will we reach out in dignity to other people who are not like us so that we can be builders of the reign of God? It is not, my friends, for later. It is not for after we die. Jesus said over and over, the reign of God is at hand, literally at hand. And the question for us is going to be over and over and over, will we lift one to help build it?